The glomerular filtration rate is defined as the amount of fluid that's filtered out of all the glomeruli in both kidneys in 1 minute. There's actually a high volume of fluid that's filtered out. In men, it adds up to about 180 liters per day. In women, on average, about 150 liters per day. Imagine if you actually had to eliminate all of that fluid that is filtered, you'd be on the pot all day long. Luckily enough for us, about 99% of that is reabsorbed later on, so that in fact we're only eliminating 1 to 2 liters per day. The way the glomerular filtration works is it's sort of the combination of several different forces. The biggest force usually is blood hydrostatic pressure. This is the blood pressure felt in the glomerular capillaries, and the higher the pressure in those capillaries, the more fluid is going to be filtered out. It's opposed by a couple of forces. The colloid osmotic pressure is the amount of stuff that's in the blood that isn't able to cross the filtration membrane, so it's stuck in the blood. It's going to create a fairly high osmotic pressure that's going to keep water or draw water back into the blood. Additionally, the filtration rate can be opposed by glomerular hydrostatic pressure. That is the pressure that's found in the capsule. So when fluid comes out of the glomerular capillaries, it's sitting in the capsule briefly, and if enough is there, it can actually sort of push back on more fluid leaving. Net, though, most of the time, you will have some filtration occurring because the blood hydrostatic pressure tends to be higher than those other pressures. There's an apparatus called the Juxtaglomerular apparatus. This occurs right in between where the afferent arteriole is coming into the glomerulus, here's the glomerular capillaries, and where the efferent arteriole is leaving. Between those two, the nephron loop goes down into the medulla and comes back. And right at the very beginning of the distal convoluted tubule where it comes back, you can see that the distal convoluted tubule comes back between the afferent and the efferent arterioles. That forms this area called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. In the juxtaglomerular apparatus, there are some modified cells that are in sort of the wall of the distal convoluted tubule. These cells are very special cells called macula densa cells. They function as osmoreceptors. They can sense sodium concentrations, and they also have flow receptors in them, so that in response to the osmotic content and the volume of filtrate that's still there as the distal convoluted tubule comes back into the cortex, adjustments could be made by the juxtaglomerular apparatus. The juxtaglomerular apparatus has some larger smooth muscle cells right along the wall of the afferent arteriole. These juxtaglomerular cells act as mechanoreceptors, and they can respond to the macula densa cells by constricting or relaxing the afferent arteriole to change the amount of blood that comes into those glomerular capillaries. The glomerular filtration rate is controlled by 3 different things that control the glomerular blood pressure. One is some autoregulatory mechanisms. A second is sympathetic control. And then there are some hormones that can also control the glomerular filtration rate. Let's start by talking about the sympathetic system. You remember that sympathetic control is part of the autonomic nervous system that you tend to see in situations of fight or flight. It can also be in situations where you're strenuously exercising or you have some acute condition that signals the sympathetic system. In general, the sympathetic system is actually going to decrease the glomerular filtration rate, which will decrease the volume of urine produced. Essentially, the blood that would be flowing into the glomerulus to make the filtrate is redirected elsewhere in the sympathetic system to skeletal muscle cells or your brain where it's more needed at that point. So that's a sympathetic system. Let's talk about some of the autoregulation patterns. The first is the myogenic mechanism. There's also something called tubulo-glomerular feedback. These sorts of autoregulations maintain a stable blood pressure in the glomerular capillaries for most blood pressures, but it can't protect against extremes. So if the blood pressure is extremely low, below 80 systolic pressure, and if it's very high, above 170 systolic pressure, these autoregulatory mechanisms are not going to be able to correct and allow the glomerular capillaries to see a steady blood pressure. So the myogenic mechanism. In the myogenic mechanism, if blood pressure is high, then smooth muscle cells that are around the afferent arteriole, in response to high blood pressure in general, will mean that there's a higher volume felt in that area. So there will be a stretch of that local area to accommodate the increased volume. And the smooth muscle cells have mechanoreceptors that, in response to that stretch, will actually cause them to contract, narrowing the afferent arteriole, which should decrease the volume of blood going into the glomerular capillaries, decreasing the glomerular filtration rate. Additional autoregulatory mechanism is called tubulo-glomerular feedback. And I sort of described this a little bit when I was talking about the juxtaglomerular apparatus. So in effect, those macula densa cells that are found as the distal convoluted tubule comes up past the glomerulus actually will secrete ATP and adenosine. And I think that's very interesting because you're used to ATP being something that can, say, phosphorylate a local protein, or it's energy for the cell. Here's an example where ATP is actually working as a local paracrine sort of hormone, or well, more like a paracrine hormone. Eventually, through several processes, they will trigger vasoconstriction of the juxtaglomerular cells around the afferent arteriole, and they can control some secretion of renin. The tubulo-glomerular feedback is a slower response system than the myogenic mechanism. If you can imagine, if the muscle cells are mechanoreceptors themselves and they sense an increase in pressure, they just contract. The myogenic mechanism would be a lot faster than tubulo-glomerular feedback, where you have to, first of all, see the change in the distal convoluted tubule. That change has to kind of initiate this sequence of chemicals to cause the effect. Okay, so what about this renin that's secreted? In fact, the renin is part of the juxtaglomerular communication, but it also is part of a general drop in blood pressure. If you have a drop in blood pressure, the kidneys make renin. The renin actually then will activate a molecule made by the liver called angiotensin. Well, it's like an angiotensinogen. The lungs make an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme. It's not necessary that you know the whole angiotensin converting enzyme, but the fact is that a lot of blood pressure medications are ACE inhibitors. ACE inhibitors stop this enzyme or decrease the activity of this enzyme so that angiotensin is not created. So it stops angiotensin from being created in response to a drop in blood pressure, or in some people, the angiotensin will actually cause blood pressure to go too high because the feedback mechanisms aren't working. In any case, once angiotensin is produced, it can work in 3 different mechanisms. One is it can actually work at the kidney to produce a hormone called aldosterone. Aldosterone triggers salt retention, sodium retention. If sodium is retained, what's going to happen with the water? Osmotically, it's going to follow the ion concentration, so you're going to get fluid retention as well. Increased fluid retention is going to raise your blood pressure. Additionally, the angiotensin at the level of the hypothalamus will make you feel thirsty. Theoretically, if you're thirsty, you drink more fluid, you have more fluid in your body, you have greater blood volume, that will increase your blood pressure. And lastly, angiotensin can also trigger vasoconstriction, and interestingly enough, this vasoconstriction affects the efferent arterioles to increase the blood pressure felt by the glomerular capillaries. What happens when glomerular capillaries feel increased pressure? They'll create more filtrate. So how does this increased filtrate actually raise your blood pressure? Interestingly enough, in this case, if you produce more filtrate, but there's still lots of stuff that couldn't get out in the filtrate, you've actually, and this happens in response to angiotensin in a greater way because of the efferent arteriole. If you're constricting the efferent arteriole, you're increasing the pressure in these glomerular capillaries, more filtrate is formed, but you're going to have a high osmotic balance in the peritubular capillary beds now. So this is going to draw fluid into these peritubular capillaries. You actually increase reabsorption in the proximal convoluted tubule. So in fact, even though you made more filtrate, in this particular case, it causes significantly more reabsorption, so you end up with less urine volume. Seems weird that in this weird instance with the efferent arterial constriction, you could end up with more filtrate, but less volume of urine. But that's what happens in this case. So overall, to summarize these different ways that we've looked at control of glomerular filtration rate, looking at them all in response to a decrease in systemic blood pressure, if you look at the sympathetic system or the neural controls over here, there are receptors that will sense the decrease in blood pressure, and they will trigger the sympathetic nervous system, which will in effect increase the blood pressure. And we said that that basically causes you to shut down the afferent arterioles. You're not making much glomerular filtrate at all in this case. Then there are the autoregulatory mechanisms. The first is the myogenic, that's just stretch in the afferent arteriole. In this case, the decreased blood pressure decreases the stretch, which will cause a vasodilation to try to get more fluid into the glomerular capillaries, increasing the amount of, the more fluid you have, you'd increase glomerular filtrate. In the tubuloglomerular feedback, you're looking at a decreased blood pressure will decrease the glomerular filtration rate. So you've got decreased sodium, decreased osmotic balance in the distal convoluted tubule as it comes back, and a decrease in flow rate. So in fact, those macula densa cells will trigger vasodilation of the afferent arteriole to try to increase the glomerular filtration rate. And in addition, the hormone mechanism, the decreased blood pressure, has triggered this renin release, which will activate the angiotensin, which will bring about the aldosterone, which is going to save sodium, save fluid to increase blood volume, and it also, angiotensin is also triggering the vasoconstriction of the efferent arterioles to, in effect, save fluid and increase blood pressure. All of these work together all of the time to keep your glomerular filtration rate just right, that it will allow just the right amount of urine to be released and keep your blood pressure at a good level.